June 1989, in the Mandara region of North Cameroon. Early every Saturday morning, the people of Plata Kapa come to the market. Among products from all over the world, they will buy the locally forged hoes, axes, and other tools essential to their farming way of life. Until the 1950s, the Plata made iron in the mountains. But now it is cheaper for their smiths to purchase scrap metal from dealers on the plains. There are still old men who remember how to smelt iron. Their knowledge, representing the last stages of a long development, can provide precious clues as to the history of a technology that over the past 3,000 years has transformed Africa and the world.
This is why we archaeologists have come to study the making of iron. We will learn both from observing the process and later from its products. We have met Ajokfa, one of the former ironmasters, and arranged with him to reenact the smelt.
Today, many Plata have cleared land on the plains to farm and build homesteads. In the old days, settlement was confined to the mountains, where enemy cavalry could not penetrate. Ajokfa is a man of the mountain.
We climb a path twisting between rocks and through agricultural terraces. Halfway up, we meet women and girls descending to fetch water, visit relatives, and to farm below. The path leads up to a plateau, enchanting in its beauty, where each family lives in its cluster of huts surrounded by terraced fields. Behind the magic is a harsh reality. Land is scarce and as carefully tended as any garden.
Each hillside is the work of generations that built fields on slopes that would, but for the terraces, have been gullied and soon eroded to bare rock. Ancestors' tombs remain in the landscape they toiled to domesticate. In their time, the plains below were wild and forested. Soon the rains will come, and there is much work to be done. The smith's hammer rings in the forge. Women have made a sufficient store of pots to last through the 4-month rainy season. The Plata begin to clear fields, the smallest tiny, with room only for 3 clumps of millet.
On the plateau, there are many remains of furnaces built into the terraces. Only their bases and shafts survive. Built of daub, clay earth bonded with straw, they've been transformed by fire into coarse earthenware. Acacias and other hardwoods give the best smelting charcoal. This we learn from Kodapai Amba, our assistant, and the human bridge between the cultures. Scott McKecken has worked with him for many months and has negotiated with Ajokfa to carry out the smelt.
Yeah, that's one layer. Yeah.
David Killick specializes in African metallurgy and has worked in many parts of the continent. I, Nick David, am project director and cameraman.
Six years before their visit, a geographer, Christian Senyobos, arranged for a smelt by an ironmaster who has since died. They find the remains of that furnace. Here we see it moments after use. Ore and charcoal are charged through the upper hole in the front of the furnace. When work was in progress, the bellowsman, urged on by a harpist, sat behind a shield and pumped air down into the shaft through a long pipe called a tuyere. Slabs of daub, propped into place by broken tuyeres, blocked up the lower opening through which iron is removed.
Much is lost as furnaces enter the archaeological record. Decoration and shield are weathered away. All that remain are the fire-hardened shaft and scattered fragments. From such evidence, parts of the process can be reconstructed, but nothing of the cultural context that supported the technology.
In paths and stream beds, black magnetite grains are sorted by water from lighter sand. This is the ore used by smelters.
On the morning of the smelt, we get up before sunrise and climb the mountain. We arrive at the furnace built by Ajokfa over a 10-day period. It is made of daub and strengthened by magic.
The furnace base, set next to a terrace, has a hole into which, just before the smelt, a charm will be placed. For strength, the shaft is built up in rings, into which, once hardened by drying, the shaft opening will be cut. The charge hole and, at the top, the opening for the tuyere pipe are formed during the building. A platform, an extension of the terrace, is then built around the back of the furnace, with some space left between and an opening to the front to hasten drying. The shield, here under construction, protects the bellowsman and binds furnace and terrace together. Tuyeres, made of a special clay and tempered with fine straw, are formed over branches. The funnel-shaped top will hang in the tuyere hole.
Before a smelt can commence, rituals take place that are an integral part of the process. This is a feast of reconciliation. By offering beer, Ajokfa ensures that no ill feelings, expressed openly or as sorcery, will disrupt the smelt. Within his homestead, women celebrate.
Ajokfa begins the work of the day, tying handles on the goat skin bellows bags. At the furnace site, his sons and other relatives build a shelter against the sun. As his youngest son brings charcoal, Ajokfa breaks up a lump of clay. He then crushes a succulent vine, a lily stem, and other plants into a lump of daub. These leaves, vines, roots, and rhizomes magically assist the furnace to fulfill its function.
For the Plata, smelting's ritual, magic, and techniques form a unity. True conservatives, they both follow and modify the ways of the ancestors.
Next, he adds oil and works the lump into the form of an egg. This will help the iron to stick together.
The furnace is personified and addressed as a young bride. The finger impressions are prayers to God. Women's bodies were once decorated by scarring in similar patterns, but the applied clay belt around her middle is that of a warrior, and the vertical strip represents Adam's apple, heart, navel, and genitals. Sex and gender are ambiguous.
The charm is offered and placed in its hole at the base of the shaft. It is covered with grit. This will prevent the molten product of the smelt from sticking to the bottom of the furnace. Chilve and Chichimek, sons of Ajokfa, lash the bags to the bellows, pottery bowls and nozzles set in a mass of daub.
Ajokfa offers a chicken to the furnace, invoking the aid of his forebears. He owns his skills by virtue of his ancestry.
Yeah.
A tuyere is inserted to hang vertically down the shaft, then plastered in place. The bellows, which have no valves, are set in position.
The top of the shield is decorated with a rooster made of clay and plant materials. Spikes represent bull's horns, and Chilve adds a crude model of a bull. These are expressions of a wider metaphor of strength and procreation that encompasses the smelting process.
The ironmaster proceeds to fill the furnace with charcoal. He uses a piece of the furnace wall previously cut away to close the lower part of the shaft opening. The piece for the top has broken. The gap is partly filled with bits from an older furnace. At 6 minutes past 10, the furnace is lit and the bellows pumped gently.
Ajokfa is having trouble blocking the shaft opening. Some space must be left for the escape of gases, mainly carbon monoxide and dioxide, produced by the reaction.
Chilve takes over the bellows and begins to pump in earnest, reaching rates of 450 strokes a minute. The first ore is tossed into the charge hole. The grains of magnetite are eroded from the local granite and have been concentrated by washing. The chicken is put to barbecue. Stoking ensures that ore and charcoal move down the shaft to the hottest part of the furnace, just beneath the tuyere tip. A crack has developed. Ajokfa must prop the shield to prevent its separation from the bellows platform. In a sequence often repeated, Ajokfa stokes the furnace and adds ore and charcoal.
Under intense heat, oxygen atoms are stripped from the ore and combine with carbon monoxide from the burning charcoal to produce carbon dioxide. Impurities in the ore and the melting end of the tuya combine to form a fluid byproduct, slag, that drips down to the base of the shaft. Ore is reduced in this way to particles of metallic iron that coalesce into a mass known as the bloom.
Further attempts are made to block the shaft opening. Poor closure is allowing massive heat loss, hindering the formation of a fluid slag that can drain away from the bloom. At intervals during the smelt, David Killick uses a thermocouple to measure the temperature, 1,335 degrees Celsius. He can see slag beginning to form.
While male onlookers sit nearby, women may not approach the furnace. Girls climb a baobab to gather young leaves cooked as greens in a sauce eaten with millet grits.
The process continues with Ajokfa's sons and his younger stepbrother spelling each other at the bellows. More charcoal is fetched. During the course of the smelt, 30 kilos of charcoal were used to smelt 14 kilos of ore, a ratio a little over 2 to 1, though some ore was wasted by spillage around the charge hole. At 12:45, ore and charcoal are added for the last time. A storm is brewing over the plain. The fire burns up through the charcoal, and we glimpse the tuyere within. Ajokfa judges the bloom, ready for removal. At 1:15, 3 hours and 9 minutes after the furnace was lit, the bellows and tuyere are removed.
Jadi kena ka. So ko sai. Dola ka magira dan bicha wikinya. Saya dah cuba kali jadi nama. Bata da cibilam din jadi buga.
The fire dies down and the shaft is opened.
The smelter, at one and the same time husband and midwife to the furnace, directs as red-hot charcoal is removed and doused to prevent injury to naked feet.
They hack at the bloom, fused to a mass of slag and grit, and then prise it out. Meanwhile, the shortened tuyere is cooling. Its lower part has melted into slag, and the stump is vitrified. The furnace has given birth, and women gather. But in the process, the back of the shaft has been damaged.
Although Ajokfa could repair the hole with daub, this and the storm dissuade us from continuing, as was Plata practice, with further smelts, up to 6 in a day. We have learned a lot, even though the bloom, here hidden in a fiery matrix, proves smaller and less compact than old ones kept and shown us by smiths.
On the next day, David returns to the furnace to discuss the smelt. Kurdapai translates. Ajokfa blames the lateness of the season and lack of time to collect the right medicines. He concedes that the ore was poorly cleaned.
Perhaps it is simply that after 30-odd years, Ajokfa is out of practice.
October 1994. Nick David, after carrying out more fieldwork in Nigeria, visits David Killick in the Department of Materials Science and Engineering at the University of Arizona.
Oh, hello, Nick.
I brought you a bloom. This one's from Sukur in Nigeria.
Wow, that's a beauty. I haven't seen any quite like this before. You see the horns of the bloom here? These are little prongs of metal sticking up. The tuyere would have come in like this from above and slightly at an angle. Down below, you can see bits of charcoal here that have not been consumed, and sticking them all together is slag. From tapping it and the sound it makes, I can tell that there's a fair amount of iron in here, but it's not the same kind of iron that we've seen in previous blooms, which are little pellets of cast iron. Now I've got something to show you. These look familiar?
These are pellets of cast iron from Ivory Coast. Until Killick and David's work in the Mandara, no one had believed that Africans intentionally produced or could forge such hard and brittle metal. Killick is now discovering that it was also manufactured elsewhere on the continent.
What I'd like you to do, David, is to take me through the lab and show me how you're going to process this.
Sure, okay. We'll take you through all the stages of that. We're now in the sample preparation lab, and the first thing we have to do is to cut a flat face in some of these samples so that we can melt them in plastic to polish them. Here I have 2 cast iron pellets upon which I've already cut a flat face, and I'm now going to take these and drop them into a sample cup here. And then I would fill the cup with epoxy resin and leave it to cure overnight. In the morning, what we end up with is a sample like this, which is embedded in a very hard epoxy resin. And this then goes on to be polished. What I'm doing here is mounting samples in a polishing fixture. This is a pressure plate here that has a spring on it, which clamps the samples in position. Whoa. At this point, we take the mounted samples to the polishing machine, clip them into the fixture like that, and then we take diamond abrasives like this, and then we switch the machine on. We polish with finer and finer grades of diamond abrasive until we have an absolutely smooth and reflective surface where we can see all the constituents of the sample underneath the microscope.
After about 45 minutes, polishing is complete.
Come on over to the microscope and we'll put this one on the table.
So this one's been polished.
Yes, that's polished but not etched. You notice how the brightly reflective metal contrasts with the slag in which is embedded. This is a sample that was not completely processed, and the slag didn't fully separate from the metal. There's a little bit of charcoal in there as well. Here's a micrograph of a sample of bloom at a magnification of about 50 times. And up at the top you
The gray
have
material
slag,
at the top is
and down at
slag,
bottom
the white
you have
is
the metal
iron,
bloom,
while black
and in
areas
between
are
you have
holes in
little
the sample,
droplets
probably
and,
formed by
threads
bubbles of gas.
iron. Here we've got a section of unetched metal. You can see the metal bloom, the iron bloom forming there. And in between you have little droplets and threads of iron that were falling through the slag at the time that the sample froze, which would have been at a temperature of about 1100 degrees centigrade. So you've got a kind of frozen snapshot, as it were, of the process of formation of the bloom.
Can you tell how much carbon there is in that?
Not yet. To do that, we have to etch the sample in a dilute solution of nitric acid.
Can we have a look at one of those?
Sure, let's go and do that now. Etching just involves rubbing the sample with a little bit of dilute nitric acid in alcohol, like this, just for a few seconds. This is the etched sample, and you can see that the grain boundaries, the edges of the crystals of iron, have been brought out by the acid etch. This shows that the sample contains almost no carbon at all. It's almost pure iron, quite soft, not very good for making tools.
As opposed to?
As opposed to cast iron, for example, or steel, both of which have very high carbon content. This is the cast iron from the same furnace. You can see in here flakes of graphite, which is pure carbon, going up there. Also cementite, which is iron carbide, which are these white bits here. The grey grains are pearlite, which is a mixture of pure iron and iron carbide. Now, what I'm going to do is to change the magnification and go up to 200 times from 50 times.
Okay.
At 200 times, you can see the structure more clearly, particularly the structure of the pearlite. The pearlite is made up of these alternate laminations of pure iron and iron carbide through here.
How much carbon are we talking about in this?
Pearlite has a carbon content of 0.8%, which doesn't sound very much, but in terms of steel, that's a lot. The graphite flakes are 100% carbon, and these areas in here, these white areas, are cementite, iron carbide, which is about 8% carbon. The average carbon content of the whole scene that you're seeing here is about 3%, which is high.
So can you forge this directly?
You can't forge cast iron directly. It's brittle. It'll split along these graphite lamellae. You need to burn out some of the carbon to be able to forge this.
Okay, so for that we need to go to the forge.
Yes.
To find out more about the samples and the processes that formed them, and especially about their chemical composition, David Killick turns to Gary Chandler, in charge of his department's scanning electron microscope. Background noise comes from the vacuum pump that extracts the air from the microscope. The sample is placed in the SEM.
With this configuration, I'm going to just make sure that it fits for the Robinsons.
The first thing I like to do is go way up in magnification and get this focused, and then we can, once we get the optics set, we can roam around on the microscope or on the sample a little bit.
What we've got here is a polished and etched sample of cast iron on one of the Mandara furnaces at a magnification of 40 times. Now, what's interesting here to me is what these little grey areas are in there. One there as well. This is a small area within the cast iron at a much higher magnification, so we're up at 800 times. And what we have here is a graphite flake, or actually two graphite flakes down there, the third one there. This is probably a hole in the specimen, I think. Here we have perlite, and you can see the laminated structure of that with the lamellae of iron carbide and the areas of pure iron in between them. And then right in the middle here, we have an interesting area which has a grain of something. We'll see what that is in a moment when we go to the X-ray map and find out what that is. What we're going to do here is bring in the X-ray detector, which will give us the ability to detect the X-rays given off as the electrons strike the sample. And that in turn will tell us the chemical composition of the area under the electron beam. Here we are at a higher magnification.
But right now it is acquiring the X-ray spectrum, and we're seeing this as X-ray counts versus energy. It's always nice to recheck this, but it's usually
Iron,
fairly close.
sulfur, strong sulfur peak, vanadium and phosphorus in there. So we can say that it's basically an iron sulfide, I guess, with a bit of vanadium in there. It presumably means that there's a little bit of sulfur.
The sulfur peak suggests the presence of that mineral in the ore. And as sulfur is not a component of magnetite, this provides a clue to exploitation of a different ore source. The next sample, which has not been etched, is of a low carbon bloom from a different smelt in the same furnace. White areas are low carbon iron, gray inclusions are slag.
These are gas puddles, possibly, or actually probably more likely areas where there was once a slag inclusion, which has been torn out in the process of cutting and polishing that. So there's a lot more slag in these, and that's because these formed by the agglomeration of little particles of solid iron. This was never molten. Probably perlite or ferrite. It's very low carbon iron.
The original top of the specimen is on the right side of the screen. Here, at the edge of the sample, a piece of iron was falling through liquid slag and was about to attach itself to the bloom on the left when the slag froze.
The slag consists of large particles of iron oxide, which are the gray particles here, in a glass, which is the dark portion there. The slag is very rich in iron oxide, so the iron oxide that's in the slag is effectively wasted. And the difference between this and the last sample we looked at, which was cast iron, is quite graphic, because with the cast iron there was very little slag formed. Almost all of the ore that was present was reduced to iron. Here you have a lot of iron that's wasted and going to make slag. This is a low magnification shot of the same specimen, which is from the 1989 expedition. And here you can actually see the reduction in place. You have little, what used to be grains of ore that have been reduced to iron, which are were falling through the molten slag towards this solid piece of iron. You can imagine this as being the top and this as being the bottom. And here you have long ribbons of iron that are falling through the slag. They're probably in ribbon shape because they were reduced at the surface of pieces of charcoal. So they effectively formed as films on the surface of a piece of charcoal. When the charcoal burnt away, they're free to fall through the slag and they drift down. And when they touch the big block of iron, they fuse to it and expel the slag. The slag is the grey portion in here. You can see what are called dendrites. These are the tree-like structures of iron oxide in here. This is the kind of classic solid-state reduction that's known from bloomery furnaces in Europe and many other parts of the world that produces low-carbon iron or steel. This is a micrograph of the slag at fairly high magnification, about 250 times. And here you can see a piece of iron, a little rounded bit of iron, fairly low carbon. Big dendrites of iron oxide here. And then as the slag froze, it must have frozen fairly rapidly because the dendrites, the late forming dendrites of iron oxide didn't have time enough to grow to that size. They're little tiny skeletal things. One of the things that structures like this tell me is that conditions in the furnace are very variable, that the structures vary enormously from one section to the next.
These furnaces are very small reaction vessels, and conditions within them vary quite wildly from moment to moment, in part with the force of the bellows, and also from one part of the furnace to another. So while we can learn a great deal about process from studying specimens of bloom and slag, it is dangerous to attempt to infer too much from a single sample. Metallurgy can also reveal the workings of the forge. Here, at Sukur in Nigeria, Hundu will demonstrate the making of bars that were once used as a form of currency. But as he will use rusty bloom fragments made around 1960, just before smelting ceased, neither the techniques nor the products will be entirely representative of that earlier period.
What?
The partially fused mass is pulled from the firebox. On the main anvil, welding begins with gentle blows from a massive stone hammer. For finer forging, Hundu uses a bar hammer of iron.
So this is the actual piece that that Hundu made in the field. How much carbon in that?
If this one's like the ones I've already examined, it'll be very low carbon content indeed, essentially pure iron. This hoe too is very low in carbon. You can see the slice we've taken for analysis, and it shows that this is essentially pure iron. It's very soft, which is why it's worn away so fast.
But how do you actually measure the hardness?
On this machine here, which is a micro hardness tester, what I have here is a sample of the very worn hoe, the one that was very blunt, and a sample cut from the tip is on the table, and I'm going to lower onto it a diamond point, and the size of the indentation made by the diamond point will give us an index of the hardness. See, the hardness of this is 134. That's really soft. No wonder that thing wore away so quickly.
So how hard is the axe?
The hardness in this portion here where the sample was taken varies from about 250 to about 500, which is quite high for the carbon content. The hardness has been increased by quenching the red hot iron into water, which is a technique that was relatively rare in Africa but common elsewhere.
And can you see that under the microscope?
Oh yes, it shows up quite clearly.
Sudden quenching of hot steel into water inhibits the formation of pearlite. Instead, we find smaller grains of a much harder substance called martensite, seen here in a SEM image at a magnification of 15,000.
You can learn quite a bit about the manufacturing process simply by looking at the surface of the object. For example, there's a very obvious weld running right through the handle there where we put the section.
So that's another.
That's another one there,
Okay,
yeah.
Fine.
Now let's have a look at this particular weld here on the microscope. Here we see a section through the shaft of that hoe. Here's the outside, the circular piece here. And you can see that it's made up of many, many small pieces of iron welded together, each separated by lamination of slag or perhaps oxide. And this seems to me to be a kind of signature of the Northern Matha forging technique, whereby many small pieces of iron are welded together. We saw this in the field in 1989. You wouldn't see something like this, I don't think, in other parts of the Mandara highlands where large solid blooms are produced. Compare that with this one. This is the tip of a very blunted axe. And in contrast to the last one, which was made up of many small pieces, this seems to have been forged out of one or perhaps two pieces of metal. There may be a weld running through here, but I'm not sure of that. These are clearly slag inclusions, so this is definitely a piece of locally smelted metal, not a piece of European metal.
And it's the hammering that produces the alignment.
Yes, these are bits of slag that were trapped in the bloom as it formed, and the hammer blows have elongated them in a direction perpendicular to the hammer blow. The hammer blow is coming down from here. Ores and slags are best studied with the technique borrowed from geology, which is optical petrography. This is a petrographic microscope. This is a geological thin section of the slag. In this viewer, you can see the light shining through the section of the slag in this case, and see the very bright colors of the iron silicate minerals in the slag. We can tell a lot from these about the temperature at which the furnace was operated, and also about the efficiency of the process, how much iron is wasted in the slag as compared to how much goes into the product.
This has been the briefest of introductions to African ironworking. We have glimpsed something of the cultural richness of Plata smelting and of the way in which magic contributed to control of a technology metaphorically linked to procreation. Metallurgical studies demonstrate that the unity and simplicity formally ascribed to African iron-working technology are misleading. Optical and electron microscopy and petrographic analyses reveal processes of bloom formation and ore sources, efficiency and waste, and how iron is welded and its qualities modified in the forge. As information accumulates, regional patterns emerge. The Mafa built tall furnaces to produce heterogeneous bloom masses that contain droplets of cast iron. Most of their neighbors manufactured several solid steel blooms in a day's work. And there are patterns, too, at a larger scale.
If we expand this from the Mandara Mountains to the sort of larger context of African iron production, there are some really interesting things that we're starting to see from research across the continent. One of them is that the apparently low-tech African furnaces are in fact quite sophisticated adaptations to an enormous variety of local conditions, much greater than we see in Europe, for example. Africans, however, never produced iron in great quantities, unlike Europe. One doesn't see the increases in productivity one sees in Europe.
Given the low population densities, Africans could develop iron production to the extent they needed by organizing communities rather than by developing special power-driven technologies. And their achievements were amazing. The village of Sukur produced well over 50,000 hoes per annum for export.
As always, research both solves and raises problems. We still know nothing of the origins of the unique smelting techniques of the Mandara highlands. For that, we need archaeological data. And there is one particular question that is puzzling Killick and David. If Sukur and other highland communities were exporting quantities of wrought iron currency bars to people living around Lake Chad, did the lowland smiths possess the techniques to recarburize the metal to steel?
Given the skills of African ironworkers, who may have made cast iron before Europeans, it seems unlikely that the farmers of the plains would have been content with soft and easily blunted tools of low-carbon iron.
Tới lạ cái đức làm nó có phải qua cái quay nhắm một tập mà dài á cái chả mấy sai cái bài chạy cái tấm ở đó hai cái nhớ bọc ra đó cấm bọc ra
Nó